It took me 4 hours to get out of Alexandra's bathroom. By the time I finally managed enough strength to get out, Alexandra had removed my mother's head and assured me that she was in a better place. The usual crap that gets said to you when a loved one dies. Olivia offered a hug to me, and I gladly accepted. Even Tempe gave me a hug the best he could. Afterward, Alexandra let me sit and cope with everything while she went about trying to come up with a way to get Creole into a grave. Soon my phone started ringing, and what I feared had happened. My dad had found my decapitated mother sitting at the kitchen table. To say he was hysterical was an understatement. "Hey, Dad," I said when I answered the phone, pulling the phone from my ear as he talked a million miles an hour. Asking what had happened, if I was safe, who could have done it. Heck, it was my boss. I answered simply. "I'll rip that fucking bastard's head off." My dad screamed. Sighing, I rubbed my button eyes with my hand and looked at Alexandra for any kind of reassurance. But she was nose deep in another book, so I wasn't going to get anything from her at the moment. "No, you won't, Dad. He's more dangerous than you could ever know. Look, just get out of town, okay? I'll handle this. Just get out before something happens to you. I can't lose you too." I whimpered to him. That seemingly got him out of his murderous rage. He calmed down and became easier to talk to. "Okay, son. If you think that's the best course of action for us," he said with a long sigh. It was obvious he was holding in all his pain and loss at that moment. "Be safe, son. I can't lose you again either," he said. A rare moment of emotion from my father. It brought a sad smile to my face. I nodded and said I loved him. He returned the favor and we both hung up. Sinking back into the chair, Olivia tugged at my jeans and forced me to look down over to her. She climbed up into my lap and hugged my torso. "She's a good kid. I can't think of any way of getting King Creole into a grave." Alexandra sighed, coming back into the living room and sitting on the couch next to us. But the annoyed frown turned into a smile when she saw the scene before her. "Come here, Livy. Let's let Travis rest for a bit. He's been through a lot today." Olivia obeyed and came over to her mother. "No, I'm okay," I said, standing up and looking at the spot where my mother's head had landed. Shaking it off, I looked over to the street and stroked my chin and thought. The shop is out of the question. The basement floor is stone, and who knows what's underneath the floorboards. I sighed. And most likely his mother knows all too well her son's weakness. Alexandra responded to Olivia, sitting on her lap and looking up while her mother brushed her hair. "So luring him to a graveyard is also out of the question. What about pushing him in a hole?" Olivia asked, wanting to be a part of this conversation. I thought about it, then realized something. Force him into the ground. That doesn't mean it has to be in a grave. Hell, I can force him into a ditch, and that counts as the ground, I said, looking to the mother-daughter duo, who looked back at me with raised brows. Alexandra looked down at Olivia and then up to me. "I have a very intelligent daughter," she hummed with a proud smile. Her accent was just a bit more posh than usual. Our moment of excitement was cut off by a loud thud upstairs. We both looked up in terror. "What was that?" I asked in hushed fear. It came from Olivia's room. Alexandra mumbled, looking down at Olivia. The little girl also looked up, the gears in her young head thinking about what could be in her room at that moment. "The only thing up there is the dolly Mr. King Creole gave me," she said, causing me and Alexandra to look at each other in terror. "There's no way. He wouldn't dare stoop that low, would he?" The loud thuds coming down the stairs behind us quickly dispelled any doubts we had. "You little shit," came a screech as something dragged itself down the stairs. Sophie, Olivia's old mother, was dragging herself down the stairs. Only the woman was looking worse for wear. She still appeared to be half doll, half human. As such, she was once again a full-sized human. But some of her body still appeared to be made of fabric, and the parts that were made of skin were sewed tight to their fabric counterpart. She was bleeding and unable to stand on her legs, which seemingly had no bones in them. Olivia screamed at the sight of her original mother and clambered into Alexandra's arms. The mother quickly scooped up her daughter and put some distance between her and the woman whose daughter she had taken. I armed myself with the only thing at arm's length. A heavy-ass book. The creature called towards us as we backed up, and to break the tension, I threw that heavy-ass book at her. The fact I cracked her face straight down the middle didn't seem to bother her. In fact, she just spawned long needle-like teeth all the way down that split in her head. "Maybe we should run," I said quickly. Which got nods from both girls. All of us booking it out of the house and out into the streets. I headed towards the car as Alexandra and Olivia piled in with me. "Do you know how to drive this automobile?" Alexandra asked me in a panic as I buckled myself in. I looked at her and nodded. "Yeah, I took 1 semester of driver's ed. Just because I didn't finish it doesn't mean I don't know how to drive." Throwing it in reverse, I smashed into their mailbox. But after that, I managed to get onto the street and gun it. It might have been bumpy any time I tried to brake, but it wasn't too bad if I do say so myself. "Alright, well now where do we go?" I asked the pair, keeping my eyes on the road and praying no cop tried to pull me over. Although by my looks I'm sure that they'd probably let me go. I do look like the guy they work for after all. "Perhaps your house. You do not have any kind of voodoo in there, do you?" Alexandra asked me as she stroked Olivia's head. The little girl was curled up, her head resting in her mother's head. Poor girl. "No. None except Tempe." I suddenly realized, slamming the brakes hard and searching my pockets for him. I looked back at Olivia to see if she had brought him, and thanks to whatever messed up god there is, she did. The doll was busy being squeezed by the afraid little girl. I breathed a sigh of relief as I turned back to continue driving. "Yeah. Except for him, we should be okay," I sighed as I drove us to my house. Arriving there, I saw that my dad's car was long gone. I entered the house first, hoping that my dad had moved my mother's headless body. He had, and I thanked him for that. Letting them in, I sat them both on our living room couch and went to go put on some coffee and find something for Olivia to try and eat. Stepping over the puddle of blood, I went to the sink and washed out the coffee pot. "She's asleep," Alexandra said as she entered the kitchen. Also stepping over the blood puddle and coming over to me. "How long has it been since you've eaten?" she asked me, looking at my pale face with some bit of concern. "A couple of days. I don't need to eat like this," I said, going and starting up the coffee machine. I received a sympathetic rub of my arm, causing me to sigh hard and shake my head. "Try to eat something. I'll handle the coffee," she said with a soft smile. I responded with a defeated nod and made my way over to the cabinets. Opening them, I was instantly greeted by a familiar smiling face. "Travis, my boy. You wouldn't believe how long I've been waiting for you," he chuckled, reaching his foot out and kicking me in the face, sending me crashing against Alexandra and landing flat on my ass. He easily hopped out of my cabinets and straightened himself up nice and good. I backed up away from him as he approached me and Alexandra. "You were waiting here for my dad, weren't you?" I shouted, standing up and grabbing the first thing in arm's reach, which turned out to be the coffee pot. Swinging it around, I managed to smash it over his head, sending him back a bit and soon enough causing him to lean against the wall, covering his head as his hat fell from his messy black hair. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. The important thing is that I have you and this traitor in the same place at the same time. He chuckled, reaching down and picking up his hat. Dusting it off with some dramatic flair, he placed it back on his head with a chuckle. "Don't worry about Olivia either. Mama always was a good babysitter," he said with a smile, the stitches on his mouth nice and tight as he did so. Alexandra grew pale as she looked out of the kitchen and towards the couch, where she had left Olivia to sleep. But Creole stepped between us and the living room. His cane tapped on the floor with malice as he began closing the distance between him and us. I looked to Alexandra, who was shaking in fear. Looking back at my former boss, I swallowed some of my fear and placed myself in front of her in Creole. "Fuck you, Charles," I sneered, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the wall. My act of bravado was quickly subdued once I was hit in the head again by a hard object, sending me slumping against the Voodoo King. He caught me easily and chuckled, patting my head with his gloved hands. "Thank you, Alexandra. I always knew you were a good girl." I cocked my head back in horror as he said those words. Alexandra stood with a pot in her hands. Another betrayal. And this one hurt the most out of all of them. She looked away with me, tears in her eyes as she backed away and let the voodoo creature take me away from my own house. As I slipped into unconsciousness, I cursed under my breath. "I'm sorry, Travis," she mumbled to me. I didn't really blame her. Between me and Olivia, I would have chosen her as well. No hard feelings, Alexandra. Although at the time I wanted to call her every swear word in the book. But I was dragged away and slipped into the ether as I was dragged out of my home. Wake up, young man. A woman's voice said, tapping my cheek with some force to wake me up. As the vision came back to my buttons, I looked around confused. This wasn't the store or even the basement. It was another stage. Similar to the one Charles had dedicated a song to his mother from. I was tied to a chair and looked around as everything became clear. Your mama Creole? I asked with a raised brow as I struggled against the ropes keeping me bound. She smiled at me and nodded, pulling a chair out and sitting down in front of me. Seeing her in good light and right in front of her, she was certainly looking good for her age. Especially since last I saw of her she was a rotting corpse. Her skin was tan like caramel and she had big black locks. Charles certainly has a liking for you. He's a sweet boy and I'm so happy he's made a friend. She said with a smile and a sigh. She suddenly produced a makeup kit and patted me with it. It appeared to be a white powder. Now ever since I was turned into a voodoo puppet, my skin has been as chalk white as Creole's. So smashing my white face with white powder seemed just pointless. Some friend he is to me. I mumbled under the constant smashings of the pad. She stopped and suddenly shoved a knife blade at my face, lowering the blade and plucking at the stitches around my throat. I swallowed hard as I stood still. She smiled as he dragged the knife across my throat. He did a very good job of bringing you back to life. He really was paying attention all those years. She smiled, pulling back and going back to cleaning me up, producing some red paint and touching up my cheeks. It was like she was getting me ready for some kind of show. And when that thought came across my mind, I instantly started to panic. Wait. Is he going to make me dance again? I mumbled, holding as still as I could as she touched up my cheeks. Please don't. I can't do that again. I begged her. She stopped her painting of me and looked at me, pursing her lips in some thought as she looked me up and down. I know how painful it must feel, dear. But can you imagine what my poor Charles went through? When that whore and her thugs ripped out his eyes and cut off his head. My sweet baby boy didn't deserve that. She sighed, producing a comb and starting to brush my messy black hair back down into the combed state it used to be in. I don't deserve this, I shouted at her, receiving a hard smack from her when I did so. She looked down at me like I was scum and grabbed me by the hair like Creole used to do when he was beyond pissed off. Know this, young man. I might have sided with you if you hadn't burnt his store down and attempted to kill him with his own victims. She snarled, shoving me back and going back to combing me. Yup. She was just as crazy as her son. Maybe all those years in the dirt really sent her in a downward spiral. Or me waking her up made her grouchy. Mama. Are you almost done? A familiar voice asked from behind the stage. Creole's face poking out from behind the curtain. I craned my neck back to try and see, but it was forced back into place and I received another smack from his mother. Almost done, baby. She hummed, waving him away back behind the counter and smiling down at me. You know, he's always wanted to post one of those stories like you do. Maybe after this performance he can. She asked with a smile. I only responded with silence. Nodding as if I had agreed with her, she stood and made her way down to the stage seats and sat in the front row. After a moment the ropes tied around me fell off and soon the strings came back down. I stared up in horror and tried to run. Only to fall on the stage floor and look back to see that my shoelaces had been tied together. And that once again I was back in a suit. Oh, God. It was happening again. And now, came a thundering voice from seemingly nowhere. The strings firmly attached themselves to me again, despite my thrashings and bitings at them. Soon they forced me to my feet. The familiar hard thug of them sending my body stiff and unresponsive to my brain's signals. But they responded to someone else. A performance of great proportions. Travis, the dancing puppet. Came the thundering voice. My stiff body was forced to bow before the crowd of Creole's mother. A smile forced back onto my face, and I stood at attention. The sweet melodies of the piano began. I already knew who it was, but the announcer made the obvious known. And the pianist extraordinaire, himself. King Creole. The announcer shouted. Creole appearing in a puff of smoke, the melody turning into fast keystrokes as he went to town on the keys. I bit my tongue in anticipation of the pain. But nothing could prepare me for it. When the strings pulled tight and forced me to dance, it was like I was tied to two horses and being pulled apart. Every swing and step I took was like a nail into each and every inch of my body. Mama Creole clapped in delight as she watched the scene. I smiled my stupid smile as I was forced to dance faster and faster as Creole seemingly picked up the pace of his playing with every dance move I made. He knew full well how much this hurt. And he wanted me to feel each and every tug and pull of the strings. I don't know how long he went for, but when it was finally over I felt like I was barely being kept together with shitty scotch tape. I hung limply from the strings. They were keeping me dangled up about an entire 3 or 4 feet from the ground. And it soon felt as if my arms would be ripped off. A beautiful performance. Mama Creole clapped, walking up on stage and throwing her arms around her son. He smiled and chuckled as he looked over at me, tilting his head at me and enjoying the throbbing pain I was in. "You look good like that, Travis. Maybe I'll keep you like that. Keeps you from snooping around," he said with a smile, taking his cane from his mother's hands and swinging it against my side. If the strings making me dance was like a million tiny paper cuts at once, the swing of his cane was like being thrown into a salt and lemon bath with all my paper cuts. It was blinding pain as I screamed out, "Charles, don't play with your toys like that." Mama Creole scared, walking over and stopping him from swinging at me again. "Save it for tomorrow, when he feels even worse," she hummed, kissing his forehead and pulling him away. They talked for a few minutes before leaving me suspended from the stage. In complete darkness. I'm fucking back here again. My only ally has thrown me under the bus. And here I am back with the fucking strings and forced to dance for the psycho and his mother. I'll get out of here. I'll show him. I will. How about King Creole take over for a spell? Travis needs a break after all.